Have you ever wondered why the ones who think the deepest often walk alone? Why the minds that illuminate the world eventually vanish into silence? It's not pride, it's not arrogance, it's exhaustion, the kind that comes from seeing too much, feeling too deeply, and realizing that the world rarely understands either. The burden of awareness is a silent weight that only a few can truly feel. The brightest minds don't just see the world, they see through it. They notice the small cracks in the foundations others stand on so confidently. They recognize the illusions that keep most people comfortable, the social games, the half-truths, the unspoken lies we tell ourselves to get through the day. Where others see simplicity, they see layers. Where others find peace, they see questions that never stop multiplying. And when your mind refuses to rest, when you can't look away from what's real, the world becomes both fascinating and unbearable. It starts innocently: curiosity, hunger for knowledge, the desire to understand why things are the way they are. But with every truth uncovered, another illusion dies. You begin to see how much of human interaction is built on performance, how people chase validation more than meaning, how comfort often matters more than truth. And slowly something inside you shifts. You stop finding joy in the things that once entertained you. You can't laugh at shallow jokes or engage in meaningless chatter without feeling detached. You start to feel like an outsider among your own kind, a stranger observing the play instead of being part of it. This awareness doesn't make them better than others. It simply makes them different. They don't isolate themselves because they dislike people, but because constant exposure to noise, pretense, and contradiction becomes exhausting. Conversations begin to feel predictable, ambitions seem hollow, and social gatherings turn into performances where everyone wears a mask. When you can see behind those masks, the act becomes unbearable, so they retreat, not to escape the world, but to preserve what's left of their authenticity. In solitude, the bright mind finds something society rarely offers: silence that tells the truth. They sit alone, thinking, observing, connecting dots others never notice. And though this brings depth, it also brings loneliness. Because once you've seen reality in its raw form, it's hard to go back to the illusions that used to keep you comfortable. Ignorance, once lost, can never be recovered. Awareness, once gained, can never be unseen. And that's the burden: to know too much, to feel too deeply, and to have nowhere to place that understanding. Even the greatest thinkers throughout history, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Tesla, Newton, spoke of this isolation. It wasn't that they despised humanity, it was that their perception placed them outside it. The more they saw, the less they belonged. To think deeply is to live on the edge of existence, between connection and detachment, between fascination and despair. You begin to realize how fragile everything is, how temporary our desires are, how much of what we call happiness depends on illusion. And once you see that, pretending becomes impossible. But the tragedy isn't that they are alone. The tragedy is that the world misunderstands their solitude as arrogance or coldness, when in truth, it is the price of clarity. They carry a vision too sharp for the ordinary, and so they fade quietly into the background, misunderstood but unbroken. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's protection. Their distance isn't rejection, it's survival. Because when you see the world for what it truly is, you can either drown in it, or step back far enough to breathe. And that step back is where solitude begins. We live in a world that moves faster than thought itself, where attention is currency, and silence is almost extinct. Every moment is filled with noise, distraction, and endless stimulation. The brightest minds, however, don't thrive in chaos. They thrive in depth, and in a society built on constant movement, their stillness becomes a rebellion. They aren't drawn to the fast or the loud. They are drawn to meaning, to understanding, to something real beneath the surface. But the world no longer values that kind of depth. It rewards quick reactions, not deep reflections, and so the deeper they think, the more distant they become. It's not that they want to disconnect. In truth, they crave connection more than anyone, but not the kind that comes from empty exchanges or curated perfection. They long for conversations that touch the soul, for moments that feel genuine, for silence that speaks louder than words. Yet what they often find instead are people distracted by screens, consumed by trends, and terrified of being alone with their own thoughts. For a bright mind, that kind of environment is suffocating. Their hunger for authenticity collides with a world that fears it, and in that clash, solitude begins to feel like the only place where honesty can breathe. Imagine someone who sees life in layers, who feels the weight of every question, who can't help but search for purpose in everything. Now imagine that person surrounded by noise, constant chatter about things that don't matter, endless scrolling through meaningless updates, laughter that fills the air, but not the heart. Over time, something inside them begins to dim. They still show up, they still smile, they still play along, but inside they feel unseen, unheard, untouched. Their thoughts no longer fit the rhythm of the world around them, so quietly, without making a scene, they begin to step away. They start choosing solitude, not because they dislike company, but because solitude offers something society can't: depth without distraction. It gives them space to breathe, to think, to simply exist, without having to perform. In that space, they rediscover clarity, the kind that modern life has stolen. They find meaning in books, beauty in silence, truth in reflection. They don't need the noise to feel alive. They find life in the quiet unfolding of thought. But the world, seeing their distance, misinterprets it. You've changed, people say, or you're too quiet now. What they don't realize is that this quietness isn't emptiness, it's peace. For the brightest minds, the modern world can feel like a storm they can't live inside of. Everything moves too fast, feels too shallow, demands too much attention for too little meaning. And so they begin to build a different kind of existence, one slower, quieter, and far more intentional. They trade the chaos for calm, the crowd for solitude, and in that trade, they find themselves again. They start to see that solitude isn't loneliness, it's preservation. It's the only way to hear their own thoughts over the world's constant noise. This is the paradox of modern intelligence. The smarter you are, the harder it becomes to fit into a society that glorifies distraction. To seek depth in a shallow world is to walk alone. But that walk, though solitary, is sacred. It's where thought turns into wisdom, where awareness turns into understanding, and where the mind finally finds the quiet it was always searching for. And that is why, in a world addicted to noise, the brightest minds fade gently into silence. Authenticity is one of the rarest qualities in the modern world. Most people spend their lives trying to belong, bending their truths, softening their edges, and wearing masks that help them fit in. But the brightest minds cannot do that for long. Their nature rejects pretense. They are wired to seek truth, even when it costs them comfort. For them, pretending feels like suffocation. Every act of conformity chips away at their soul, until they are left with a simple, brutal choice: fit in and lose themselves, or walk alone and remain whole. From a young age, they often feel out of sync with the world around them. While others learn to adapt, they question. While others imitate, they analyze. Their honesty can be disarming, sometimes even uncomfortable. They don't know how to sugarcoat reality. They speak from the core of their being, but society rarely celebrates that kind of raw truth. It wants agreeable faces, not honest voices. It wants politeness, not principle. So the more authentic they are, the more they clash with the surface-level harmony that most people maintain. Over time, they start to see that authenticity has a price, and that price is belonging. They lose friends, not because they stop caring, but because they refuse to pretend. They lose opportunities because they won't play politics. They lose relationships because they value truth more than validation. And yet, even in their solitude, they carry a strange kind of peace. They may feel misunderstood, even lonely, but they also feel free, because freedom doesn't come from being accepted by everyone. It comes from not needing to be. The brightest minds often realize that authenticity and popularity rarely coexist. To stay true to themselves means being willing to stand alone in a world that thrives on imitation. Their values make them outsiders. Their convictions make them inconvenient. They can't sit comfortably in shallow conversations or pretend that everything is fine when it isn't. And so they begin to drift away, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. It's not that they think they're better than others. It's that they refuse to betray the truth that defines them. There's a quiet nobility in this kind of solitude. It's not the loud defiance of rebellion, but the calm strength of integrity. They walk away not because they want to, but because they have to. They understand that pretending to fit in is a slow form of dying, a gradual erosion of identity, and they would rather be alone with their truth than surrounded by those who only accept a version of them that isn't real. In their solitude, they find clarity. In their silence, they find peace. In their truth, they find strength. Yet this path is not easy. There are nights when the loneliness feels heavy, when the silence echoes louder than comfort allows. But even then, they know that solitude built on authenticity is better than company built on illusion. Over time, they stop seeking validation and start seeking alignment, not with others, but with themselves. They realize that being understood by a few is far more meaningful than being liked by many. And so, while the world keeps chasing belonging, the authentic mind chooses something rarer, self-respect. They may fade from social circles, but they rise within themselves. Their solitude isn't a loss, it's a declaration, because in a world addicted to imitation, staying true to yourself is the purest act of rebellion. Solitude has a strange reputation. To most people, it looks like emptiness, a kind of quiet exile reserved for those who couldn't keep up with the world. But for the brightest minds, solitude is not a sentence. It's a sanctuary. It's the place where thought deepens, clarity returns, and the chaos of the world finally makes sense. What others see as isolation, they experience as transformation, because in silence they are no longer reacting to life, they are creating it. When a bright mind withdraws, it's rarely out of bitterness. It's more like a shedding, a slow peeling away of everything false. The noise of society, the pressure to conform, the endless pursuit of approval, all of it falls away in solitude. What's left is something raw, unfiltered and true. They start to listen to their own voice again, that inner guide that gets drowned out in the rush of everyday life. And in that stillness, they begin to understand themselves in ways they never could before. They don't just think, they observe. They don't just exist. They become aware of what existence really is. History's greatest creators understood this intimately. Beethoven composed in isolation. Newton discovered the laws of gravity in seclusion. Van Gogh painted in loneliness. It wasn't the crowd that shaped their brilliance. It was the silence that gave it room to breathe. Solitude allowed them to see what others missed, to connect dots hidden by the noise of the world. Their loneliness wasn't a void. It was the soil where genius grew. And while solitude can be cold at times, it also carries a certain warmth. The warmth of self-realization, of knowing that one's inner world is enough to sustain meaning. In that quiet space, something subtle happens. The mind, once overwhelmed by the weight of awareness, begins to heal. Thoughts align, emotions settle, and ideas take shape. What once felt like a curse, the inability to blend in, to stay distracted, transforms into a gift. Solitude becomes the mirror where truth finally reflects clearly. It's not easy to face yourself so completely, to confront the parts of you that the noise once helped you ignore. But through that confrontation comes growth. Through that stillness comes strength. And then comes a shift, a realization that solitude isn't the end of connection, but the beginning of a higher one. It teaches them how to connect differently, not through constant interaction, but through understanding, through depth, through the quiet appreciation of existence itself. They begin to see beauty in simplicity, wisdom in silence, and meaning in the smallest details of life. The sunset, the turning of pages, the sound of rain, these become sacred again. The world they once retreated from becomes more vivid, not less. In the eyes of others, they may seem to fade, less social, less visible, less involved, but internally, They are burning brighter than ever. Their solitude isn't decay, it's refinement. It's the slow, patient work of becoming. And while the world rushes ahead, they stand still long enough to see it clearly. Solitude doesn't destroy the brightest minds, it completes them, because sometimes disappearing from the world is not about escape, but about evolution. In the end, the brightest minds do not vanish. They transcend, they walk away, not because they've given up on the world, but because they've outgrown its noise. In their silence, they build new worlds. In their solitude, they find truths too vast for crowds to understand. What looks like fading is in truth transformation, the quiet rise of a mind that no longer seeks to be seen, but to see clearly, because the brightest light doesn't always shine in public. Sometimes it glows alone in the dark.